Hello, everybody, and I'm really sorry for you guys that you have to listen to a litigation attorney. And it's not quite nice usually, but this time I'm trying to be friendly towards you guys. My subject that I'm presenting or giving this presentation about is the so-called European Account Preservation Order. And a short question to you all. There's lots of bank people over here and from financial sector. How many of you have heard the word EAPO-REGULATION or European Account Preservation Order? 1, 2, 3 maybe. To start with, this EAPO regulation that I'm talking about it's a whole new law and an instrument to be used in civil matters, not in criminal law matters, not in cases relating to money laundering, for example. It relates only to civil law procedures and to procedures where, for example, two entities, banks or whatever companies have entered into an agreement, and the other party starts to suspect that his cooperating party is doing something dishonest, and he or she or a company might be misusing the funds that he or she or the company has, and by doing so might create damages to the creditor. And one thing especially interesting about the so-called EAPO regulation, I will go more specifically into the subject during with my slides over here. But the thing is that it relates to both fintech and money, because the regulation itself, it's written in a formal way which relates more or less directly to the fintech side, or the so-called classical fintech side, meaning that you have to have bank accounts. And also it relates to freezing assets, freezing money as it is de facto, in electronical form in a bank account. In any case, I've written 2 books about civil law matters, and now I've started to do my dissertation, doctoral dissertation about the EAPO regulation, and I was a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute in Luxembourg last year, and that's why I got requested to give this short presentation to you guys also. So let's start. First of all, from a law perspective, and I'm terribly sorry this might be to some extent boring to non-lawyers especially, but there has been so-called enforcement legislation for several decades already in the EU and the European community. The most important thing regarding the so-called freezing of assets, which is a so-called ex ante proceeding, which means that the person who is the goal, the person whose assets is the goal of the whole proceeding, will not be heard at all of the application itself. Not in the EU, not in any country where this person might be. And this has now become, this is now in force since January 2017. I'm all the time doing studies that has it been used, and according to my studies, I do not know that it has been used, this EAPO regulation, yet, but it's only a matter of time, of course. In a nutshell, the point of the EAPO regulation, which means European Account Preservation Order, the point of the EAPO regulation is that when a creditor suspects that the other company might not be paying, for example, the trade agreement's purchase price, might not be repaying his or her debt to the other company or the person in question as the creditor, they may initiate a so-called freezing proceeding in one EU country against the debtor, which has to be in another EU country. For example, if I would be a Finnish company and I would have an agreement with a French company, I could start this freezing proceeding in Finland and get a freezing order in France, only acting with the Finnish court, which is the Helsinki District Court in Finland. In a nutshell, this establishes a new uniform of a European procedure to enforce cross-border receivables. And it's quite interesting due to the fact that you can start it without even getting the other person to be notified of it. It has the so-called surprise effect with it. As I mentioned, it's only a one single decision and order which can elaborate in a way that freezes the assets of another party. Here are lots of banking people from financial institutions listening to this presentation also. And the most interesting matter is that when especially big companies are trying to enforce this EAPO order against each others, how do the so-called nominational cash pooling systems that a big group of companies may have is regarded in this proceeding? We don't have actually any idea how it would work compared to a sweeping cash pooling instrument, which means that the money is de facto transferred between the group of companies in a case where you would be using an EAPO matter or an EAPO order against this group of companies specific member. It's going to be a huge mess, especially for the banks when it will be the first time used. As a result of this EAPO regulation, the assets of the debtor anywhere within the EU, and this is a really important thing, even though we have now Brexit ongoing, the British member of the EU at that time still is, decided to so-called opt out. So this cannot be used in the United Kingdom or neither in Denmark. But in every other EU member state, this is law now. And assets of the debtor may be frozen in any other country, meaning that if I get a Finnish order from a Finnish court, I can enforce it in other countries, France or Germany or Spain and so forth. It's not scoped from that perspective. It's not scoped from how with the meaning of how or where you can enforce the decision. The other side and the more tricky side of it is that in cases where there isn't any cross-border functionalities, this cannot be used. And that's the most important problem that I've now found out in my studies, that due to the fintech revolution that is currently ongoing, it's really hard to say where a certain account may be found, let's say, a few years forward from this moment. And as you are aware of, the IBAN code itself has to be set and defined into a specific country, but as we have seen today, it might be so that an IBAN code might be at some stage in the future cancelled with regards to the connection to the specific country where the bank account has been issued. Therefore, this EAPO regulation might not become as practical and as it might become a dead law from the usage point of view. It has to be emphasized really carefully that the EAPO regulation may only be used in situation where the civil law rights of the creditor due to the money assets that are used by the debtor have a strong right. It has to have a fumus boni juris, a smell of good right in the creditors from the creditor's side, and it has to be strong. In a manner that the court may issue and give the EAPO order. However, on the other side, there is one Oxford scholar, Mr. Kyriakides, who's writing this from the English law perspective, and we had a talk about this specific thing, that how should you measurize what is a strong right for the creditor to start enforcing, and he was of the opinion that the discretion of the court to decide what is the strong and less strong right is totally unregulated at the moment. And this means that it might become a coin flipping contest at the end when you send an EAPO application to a court, that they just flip the coin and say, well, we consider that you have a fumus boni juris, or a good right and a strong good right to start this proceeding. Well, due to the fact that there aren't any clear rules, at least yet, since we don't have any case law concerning the EAPO regulation, and it will take approximately 6 years that we will have some kind of regulation or case law that would clarify how it will be used in practice. The most important things for all the companies that are listening to this presentation is that when drafting bigger contracts and agreements in the future, you have to take into account the possibility of the misuse of the EAPO regulation against you. We had Stora Enso's CFO speaking here prior to me, and he said that they have, 200 accounts all over the world. That may be a risk from the EAPO regulation perspective if Stora Enso enters into an agreement with a company which decides to use this against Stora Enso. If they would have not so strong right, let's say tens of millions of euros or dollars to start the EAPO proceeding in some EU country, the risk might be that when this is misused, Stora Enso will not be notified of the application, and it will be straightly enforced, meaning that Stora Enso will be notified at that point when their accounts have been frozen. And that's a severe risk, of course, because if that happens, there isn't any clear time frames when it has to be clarified, or when the assets will be unfrozen again. So that's a main concern of me concerning the EAPO regulation, how to agree that this regulation will not be followed in certain agreements and so on. There is, of course, some ways that the courts may hinder and make it harder for the creditor to start the EAPO regulation proceeding. There is a mandatory general rule, and this is also something which is quite strange. It's only a general rule, as it is actually also in the Finnish law system with the Finnish interim injunctions, that the creditor who is applying for the EAPO regulations cash freezing order, he or she or a company has to provide the court with the security, which means that in my perspective, and that we don't have any case law yet, if you are demanding for a 10 million euro bank freezing order, you might have to put 10 million euros as a security to the court and to the enforcement officers that would cover the damages that the enforcement of the order would create. However, there are lacks in the regulation itself concerning also this. This is due to the fact that this is only a main rule. There is exemptions which are quite wide from what I've read in my studies, and due to those lacks of the law, of the regulation, this is also a risk that it doesn't as such create or totally make it a risk-free proceeding to any company. Well, more importantly, also something that is definitely noteworthy, and this is a universal thing concerning all kinds of interim injunctions, that the creditor, if he didn't, or he or she or the company does not have the right, didn't have the right to even initiate the EAPO regulation proceeding, and it's later declared that his right was actually wrong. In those cases, the creditor which has initiated a false EAPO measure has to pay damages to the party in those matters. The problem is, and this is also a universal problem, that it takes years to enforce it, and it takes years to get through the big main trial. And it might be at the end of the day that the creditor which didn't have the right to start even the EAPO proceeding in the beginning might become bankrupt or insolvent or not be even existing at the time when it's decided. Once again, a risk to companies operating with matters that may create EAPO measures against them. Well, I'm going to end my presentation on a few guides how to use the EAPO and how to avoid the EAPO risk. To start with, I know that this is only we're only on the top of the regulation, and we haven't go by in any means to the depthness of the EAPO, which is a really hard and demanding regulation to know and to use. But the main positive thing why the EU decided to create this legislation is that by knowing, even that we know that, okay, if I really, if I don't behave properly for most importantly in business relations, and this goes to applies to everything you do in the EU as a consumer to some extent also. If you do not behave according to your obligations, and even though it would not be a crime, it would not be a severe fraudulent crime or misusage of assets or money laundering or nothing to do with the criminal law matters. If you're only breaching EU legislation, and I have one case currently pending where our client's agreement party is clearly violating all the obligation the company has according to the agreement. And we have sent them a letter now, and we said that we will take into notice and maybe start any and all proceedings according to the EU law. And we specifically emphasize that please note that we have this new EAPO regulation. And we haven't used it yet, but we gave them a signal that please note that we can even freeze your assets if you will not if you will not start behaving according to your contract obligations. So it has a this kind of a preventive functionality. And in cases and in situations where an adverse party of yours, and especially adverse contract parties, I would not start this proceeding in any other situations if you don't have a clear contract. But in the situations where there is a clear adverse contract party which clearly breaches its obligations, the EAPO regulation may be used as leverage also before initiating any court proceedings. The risks have to be taken into consideration strongly, because there is the damages obligation, the obligation to pay damages, the obligation to set the creditor's security and so forth. But on the other hand, all companies, especially companies, and to some extent even natural persons like us as individuals, we have to take into account the fact that there is now this kind of a regulation which may be misused against us. And it would be quite terrible if you go to a vacation to Greece, the service of your hotel is terrible, and they say that you have, let's say, damaged their possession and say that you owe them 20,000 euros. And well, before this year, you could have, to some extent, just walk away and say that this is terrible. I won't pay this. This is unlawful, and etc. And go back to Finland. But nowadays, if this is a really creaky and dishonest hotel owner, he might even start this proceeding against you by freezing your assets with the full amount of, let's say, 20,000 euros. And that might be, well, it depends on the person that is in question. That might be a big thing. So that's only my point of this presentation, that please take it into account and well, don't lose your good night's sleeps, but still, if there's something troubling about it, so just give me a call. Thank you.